unless there's a higher order principle that unites people either psychologically or socially, then they're disunited. And if they're disunited, they're anxious and confused and aimless and conflict-laden. Like the natural state of human beings in the absence of a unifying principle isn't peace, it's war. And so then we might ask, is there a unifying transcendent principle that's valid, that isn't just another narrative? Because the postmodern critique is that all unifying narratives are, what would you call it, expressions of arbitrary power and domination. And I don't really think that's true. I don't think that's true of Western societies. And the reason I think that's technically untrue is because there's an idea in Western society that I think is fundamentally, well, it's logos-based, it's partly Greek and it's partly Judeo-Christian, that the individual is the proper level of analysis in some real sense, and that the individual has intrinsic worth and dignity. But there's more to it than that, is that it's necessary for the for that intrinsic dignity and worth of the individual to be recognized and set apart by law, in some sense, honored by law, because the individual has something to offer to the group. And that's the uniqueness of their being, let's say, and that if you allow people to be free or encourage their freedom, then they can trade that uniqueness with everyone else in freely, and that in that trade is to be found both peace and, let's say, and abundance. And I think that principle isn't merely another narrative. I think that is the predicate both of peace and of economic well-being. And so, but
I
conservatives and, okay,
I think
let you comment on all that.
Or another way of putting it is the United States was based on an idea of equality of opportunity, that because we're not born equal, or we have different life experiences, or we inherit or don't inherit, or we're healthy or we're long-lived or not, we don't try to even that out in terms of economic recompense. We just let people follow their own trajectories, and then we have other methods to appeal to their magnanimity. So the philanthropic, the religious, the humanism. We have all these ways that if people do better than other people, we allow them to be creative and to try to give back to the society, or at least use their talents, even if it's profit-minded, to build a better bridge or a dam, rather than the alternate, which is a strain in Western civilization. It starts actually, the socialist impulse starts with the Greeks. There is a strain of that with the Pythagoreans. But the other idea, and that's what we're, I think, fighting now, is the woke equality of result, that we're going to appoint some plutonic guardians and give them untold power. And in their infinite wisdom, they're going to do two things. They're going to force people to be equal, what they call equity, and they're never going to be subject to the consequences of their own ideology, because they need special exemptions given their enormous responsibilities and their talent. And so what we see now is this bi-coastal elite in the United States is starting to mandate behaviors and principles and issues and policies that they themselves would never follow and would have no intention of following. And it's based on that every single person has an innate right to be the same as another person. Or as Aristotle said, once a man in democracy, and he feared this, feels that he's equal in voting with another man, then he feels, by extension, he should be equal in all other aspects of his life. And that was the philosophical worry about democracy, that it always evolved to a more radical form of equality. I think we're now at the end stage where almost everybody feels they have a grievance against the state, and therefore they're entitled to compensatory or reparatory money or land. Here in California, when we were discussing reparations, suddenly people were bidding in the Oakland City Council and suggesting that they were owed $800,000. And they had a grievance, apparently, even though they were 6 generations away from slavery and maybe 4 from, they were in the 4th generation of the civil rights movement. They had grievances against people who had never had slaves, and California for example, had never been a slave state. But it was that mentality, and a lot of people warned us about this. Tocqueville said the problem that we would face in the United States is that most people innately would rather be poor and equal than all better off, but some more better off than others. And he felt that if
Yeah, well,
that would be a very dangerous development. I think we're pretty much there now.
yeah, well, that's, I suppose, to some degree, why there's an injunction against covetousness in the Ten Commandments. That you're not supposed to covet or envy your neighbor's donkey or his wife or his house. And
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason for that is that if no one can have anything more than anyone else, then no one can have anything at all. And that's generally been the state of humanity for the longest reaches of human history. It looks very much like if we're going to allow a rising tide to raise all boats, we have to allow some people to rise faster than others in multiple dimensions. And I don't see any way out of that, and certainly not the case that these hypothetically egalitarian systems of governance like communism ever produced anything that had less of a Pareto distribution or an unequal distribution than capitalist societies. I mean, everyone was much poorer, but the rich were still much richer than everyone else. And there's also something in there, you talked about identity, and I've watched this happen on the, what would you call it, inevitable consequences of pathological thought front. So the leftists who are pushing for equality of outcome insisted that if there were differences in socioeconomic outcome that you could identify by group, then that was a prior evidence of systemic oppression, let's say. But they fell astray of a certain peculiarity with regards to group identity, which is that group identity is actually infinitely fragmentable. And so out of the initial identity political theorists, you got the intersectionalists who made the case that, well, you were oppressed, let's say if you were Latino, and you were oppressed if you were female, but the joint interaction between Latino and female made you even more especially oppressed, and then you could add gay to that or whatever other. And what you see happening on multiple fronts in consequence is that the litany of potential ethnic groups increases, the number of them, and then the number of interactions increases, and that increases exponentially as you add more identity categories. And what that essentially means is that the problem of computing equity starts to become technically impossible, because every single person's identity is so complex on the intersectional front that there isn't even a hypothetical way of deciding whether any given socioeconomic outcome is equitable. And so when I walked through that, I thought, well, Western culture had actually solved that problem several thousand years ago by pointing out that the appropriate level of analysis is the individual, because the individual has a unique identity that is in some sense a consequence of all their multiplicitous group identities, but singularly, what would you say, singularly representative of each individual. And so then you let individuals compete and cooperate in a fair market, and that's the best possible way of moving towards the right balance between equity and wealth. That's what it looks like. And
I think that's right. And you can see that where this leads to, it's logical that you would end up with a Ward Churchill or Elizabeth Warren that by needs would fabricate a victimized identity. She was the first, quote unquote, Native American professor of law at Harvard on that basis alone. And then on the other realm, when you start to replace class interest or economic status with race, then the left really hit on something. I think it was really Barack Obama in between 2009 and 2016. He took a rather ossified word, diversity, and he recalibrated it to mean we're not going to look for victims on the basis of their income anymore, because that's mutable. In fact, Marxism never worked in the United States because this free market capitalism and a lot of free land in the 19th century was always a movement of upward mobility, and therefore you would never have a continually oppressed class. In fact, today people go up and down, out and in of the middle and the upper middle classes. So what I think Obama did was he redefined race in America as not a binary between 88% white and 12% black, but he came up with this word diversity that replaced class differentiation.